Isabeau of Bavaria, or Elizabeth von Wittelsbach as she was known when she was born, would be variously described in history as a beautiful woman, an ugly woman, a woman who commanded respect as regent, and as a woman who didn't know what she was doing politically. Wife to the mentally ill Charles VI of France, Isabeau's time as queen would be beset with challenges and political rebellion, and much of what is known about her reflects the changing environment and divisions of France at that time. Isabeau was a daughter to one of the most powerful families in the German states, the Dukes of Bavaria. Her father was Stephen III of Bavaria-Ingolstadt, and her mother was an Italian noblewoman called Taddea Visconti, and she was born around 1370, most likely in the city of Munich. While Isabeau's family branch was not necessarily the most important of the Bavarian dukes, she was still descended from her great-grandfather, Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV, and Charlemagne through her father, and both sides of her parentage boasted several lands under their control across Europe. She would have had the best upbringing possible for a young girl at the time, as she was nobility. This would have included learning to read and write, music and dancing, languages, and not just understanding how to run a household, but also how to behave at court. Certainly from a young age, Isabeau was marked out for a future at court in some capacity, as was her only sibling, her brother Louis, and this would have been a main focus. Her mother died when she was 11, but Isabeau seems to have maintained close ties with the rest of her family, as evidenced later in her life through letters. Not surprisingly, given her lineage and upbringing, it wasn't long before Isabeau's future marriage was thought of. Her first proposal came when she was about 13 in 1383, when her uncle, Duke Frederick of Bavaria-Landshut, first suggested a match with the young Charles VI of France, who had become king just a few years earlier in 1380 when only 12 years old. For France, Isabeau represented an alliance against the English, as the German nobility had roots and alliances of their own with the Holy Roman Empire and the growing might of Spain. Charles himself was eager to be married, and he was an attractive, healthy young man who was, obviously, a king. It was a good match for any princess. Although little is known of the relationship between Isabeau and her father, there is some suggestion of the protective, fatherly care he had for her in regards to her marriage. He was adamant that Isabeau should not actually know she was going to France to be considered as a possible bride, and he agreed only reluctantly, with the understanding that she would not, as was custom at the time, be inspected while naked. Initially, Isabeau believed they were travelling to France only under the pretext of taking a pilgrimage to Amiens. However, about a month before going to France, Isabeau went to Hainaut to stay a while with her relatives, with her uncle, Duke Albert I, Count of Holland, and his wife Margaret of Brigue. This was primarily to prepare her for the French court, firstly by swapping her Bavarian style of clothing for French dress, which was considered more suitable for courtly attire. While she would also have learned etiquette as a child, Margaret no doubt taught her the finer etiquette required at the French court, which at the time was considered to be one of the leading European courts in culture and style. Isabeau was a quick study, easily learning what she had to in a short amount of time, indicative of her later displays of intelligence and quick-wittedness. On the 13th of July 1385, Isabeau finally travelled to Amiens to be inspected, and she apparently had perfect manners throughout, according to contemporary chroniclers. On the 17th, Charles himself finally laid eyes on his new bride, and he reportedly fell instantly in love with her, or in slightly less romantic fashion, at least immediately found her attractive. Jean Froissart wrote that the king felt happiness and love enter his heart, for he saw that she was beautiful and young, and thus he greatly desired to gaze at her and possess her. We're not actually sure what she looked like, as there are directly competing descriptions of Isabeau. Some say she was tall and blonde like the fashionable ideals of the time, while other descriptions of her say she was short and brunette like her mother with her beautiful dark Italian features. Either way, the young couple were married a few days later on the 20th of July, a mere week after she had first arrived. Her new husband had left the day after their marriage to wage a military campaign against the English, and Isabeau went to stay with his step-great-grandmother, Queen Dowager Blanche. And by all accounts, he doted on his new wife, lavishing her with gifts of tableware, jewellery and clothing. Isabeau's presence was political from the start. Aside from the fact her marriage had been encouraged by Philip of Burgundy, whose interests aligned with those of her family, she was approached in the late 1380s by the Florentines at court. They wanted her help in what became known as the Jean Gilezzo Visconti affair. Jean Gilezzo had disposed of and murdered Isabeau's maternal grandfather, Bernabo Visconti, and then married his daughter Valentina to Louis I, Duke of Orléans, the younger brother of Charles VI. He formed an alliance with the Duke of Burgundy at court. We can already see how this was going to get messy. While she had little influence at this point, Isabeau was able to help form an anti-Gilezzo faction with her brother, Louis, and John III, Count of Armagnac. On the 23rd of August 1389, Isabeau was finally crowned in a lavish ceremony that included her formal entry to Paris, despite having been married for 4 years at this point. There were entertainers and acrobats, and the women who accompanied Isabeau were dressed in outfits trimmed with gold thread. Most theatrically of all was the moment as the new queen passed over the Grand Pont de Notre Dame, however, in which a person dressed as an angel was lowered by mechanical means through the blue fabric swathed overhead, placing a crown on Isabeau's head. After the coronation, a huge feast was held alongside narrative pageants that were planned for only the first day of 5 days of festivities. Isabeau was 7 months pregnant at the time with her second child, and she fainted, probably from a combination of the heat and exhaustion. Isabeau would have 12 children in all, and unusually for the time period, all of them are very well recorded. Her first child was actually born in 1386, a boy named Charles after his father, but he died while still in infancy. Her second child was a girl named Joan, who was born in 1388 but passed away at just 2 years old. These must have been devastating losses for Isabeau and Charles, not only because these children represented the continuation of the French royal family in an unbroken line, but also because they were committed parents, and Isabeau was well known for keeping her children close to her at all times while they were young. The child with which she was pregnant during her coronation was Isabella, who would go at an extremely young age to marry Richard II of England, but would live only until she was 19 years old during her second marriage. After this came Joan, born in 1391, and their first surviving son, again named Charles, but he would sadly die aged 8 of a wasting illness. Then came Michelle, born in 1395, Louis in 1397, John in 1398, Catherine of Valois in 1401, who would go on to marry Henry V of England, and yet another Charles in 1403, who would become Charles VII on his father's death. Their final son was born in 1403 named Philip, but he died while still a baby. Isabeau ensured her children travelled with her whenever she could. She brought them gifts and arranged for her daughters as well as her sons to receive the best education possible. However, in 1392, Isabeau's role as queen would be upgraded due to events regarding her husband Charles. On a hot August day that year, he was leading an army on the way to Brittany when he experienced the first of what would sadly be many bouts of insanity over his lifetime. Apparently, the king had been feverish and incoherent in the days leading up to the event, but on this day, a crazed man reportedly rode through the woods and charged at the king's horse, shouting, "Ride no further, noble king! You are betrayed!" The king's knights pushed the man away and they rode out of the woods. When they did so, one of the pages dropped Charles's lance with a loud clang which spurred the king into a frantic and unprovoked attack. Drawing his sword, he began to attack his own men, including his own brother Louis, and 4 of them died. Afterwards, the king fell into a coma for 4 days. Whether or not the events leading up to the attack are true or fabricated to help understand Charles's state of mind, his sudden onset of madness was seen by many as either divine punishment or magic. His uncles, the Dukes of Berry and Burgundy, who had previously been pushed out by him, used his illness as an opportunity to place themselves as regents for him. They dissolved the council of advisors Charles had surrounded himself with, made up of clerics and lesser nobility. Many of them fled for their lives, and Philip of Burgundy set himself as the head of the government. Louis was denied any position at all, but Charles, whether from genuinely forgetting his uncle's further troublemaking or simply because he was too nervous to fight it in his current state, did nothing to change this, and instead thanked his uncles for taking the reins. He had only come out of his coma thanks to the ministrations of Guillaume de Hassigny, a famous 92-year-old physician who also suggested a program of entertainments to rouse the king from his illness. After Charles was returned to Paris in September, the courtiers came forward with ideas, and in 1393, one courtier suggested an event that would have catastrophic consequences. This would come to be known as the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. The suggestion was that Charles and a group of courtiers should dress as wild men of the woods and surprise Isabeau and her ladies during the marriage of one of the Queen's ladies in waiting. Just the thing for recovering from a mental health crisis. It went about as badly as can be imagined. A lit torch brought by Louis, Duke of Orléans, set fire to one of the courtiers' costumes, which spread quickly, killing 4 men and almost killing the king. It was a disaster which confirmed for many that the king wasn't fit to rule, and public unrest threatened to spill over into rebellion. It was a pattern that would continue over the years as Charles went through episodes of his mysterious illness, but he would progressively grow worse. As it became clear he was never going to fully recover, despite some periods of lucidity, Isabeau began to distance herself slightly. This began partially because in his worst states, Charles didn't even recognise the Queen and would ask for her to be removed from his presence. For a woman who had obviously been loved by her husband, it must have been a horrible experience for Isabeau. Eventually, it would be decided that it was best if a mistress was provided for Charles to prevent Isabeau's distress when he didn't recognise her. This was reached with Isabeau's consent, and the woman chosen was named Odette de Champdivers, the daughter of a horse dealer who was said to resemble the Queen. In his lucid periods, the king would continue his romantic and sexual relationship with his wife as though nothing had happened, and equally she showed him affection and gave him gifts during those same periods. It's clear that Isabeau was ensuring the best possibility of maintaining the crown for her children while distancing herself when needed. Isabeau, although she was not yet in a great position of power compared to the regents, began to exercise the political muscles she did have. By April 1396, between her father losing importance and the king's madness, Valentina Visconti had to leave court under accusations of witchcraft. Charles was furious at Galeazzo for other reasons, including that he had tried to turn the Pope against France, and so the Florentines at his court were being listened to more. At the wedding in the same year of her young 7-year-old daughter Isabella to Richard II of England, Isabeau would negotiate an alliance between France and Florence with the Florentine ambassador. It wasn't the only time her diplomatic skills were recognised either. Since 1378, the Western Schism had existed, a split in the church in which popes in both Rome and Avignon claimed to be the true pope. It was, of course, all tied into political allegiances, but in the 1390s, Jean Gerson, who was later the Chancellor of the University of Paris, formed a council to discuss how to repair the rift, and he invited Isabeau to sit on it. The French wanted both popes to stand down in favour of reforming a single papacy in Rome, and the Avignon Pope, Clement VII, was very favourable to Isabeau being part of the council. It shows that she was respected for her skills as a mediator and politician, and that being a woman didn't prevent Isabeau from taking part. This will partially have come from the medieval idea that a queen was a mediator on behalf of her husband, and that she had an important role as a peacemaker. Isabeau was simply extending this queenly duty further into international politics that involved most of Europe. But Charles himself would go further than this. During one of his lucid periods in 1393, he proclaimed that Isabeau was to be the principal guardian of his son, the Dauphin, which also gave her more power on the Regency Council over the king's uncles and brothers, as well as making her co-guardian of all their other children. The following year, Isabeau was able to take control of the Regency Council, and while this gave her more power, it also made her more vulnerable to attack. Louis, the Duke of Orléans, became the official tax collector for the crown, and this gave him financial control when combined with the several vassals he obtained between 1401 and 1403. He and Isabeau came to an agreement in the early 15th century to raise taxes, and this was compounded in 1401 by Louis installing his own men as tax collectors in order to increase the kingdom's finances by including their own wealth. But what really caused a problem was that Louis's acquisition of these lands bordered many of Philip the Bold's, and threatened others the Duke of Burgundy was set to inherit. There were only so many times Philip would ignore this, and in that year on the 7th of December, he raised an army of nearly 700 men, entering Paris and threatening violence. Once again, however, Isabeau's silver tongue saved the citizens of Paris as she intervened between Philip and Louis and helped them reconcile. She did so well with this that in 1402, Charles trusted his wife enough that he allowed her to continue soothing the dispute between the Burgundians and the Orléanists, and he even turned the royal treasury over to her control. However, when Philip the Bold died in 1404, his son, John the Fearless, became Duke of Burgundy, and he set his sights on gaining access to the royal funds. Louis, of course, distrusted John and made it clear he thought the Burgundian Duke was going to usurp power for himself, neatly forgetting that he was likely doing the same thing. Isabeau, sensibly but still provocatively, put her children first and sided with the Duke of Orléans. It was in their interest to keep friendly with their uncle over a cousin of the king, and she also felt John was acting outside of his station. However, this of course led to rumours that the Queen was sleeping with Louis, which was the height of scandal not only for being a supposed affair, but because she was a queen, and because as in-laws their relationship would have been considered incestuous if it had been true. An Augustinian friar called Jacques Le Grand gave a sermon in which he was careful to present it as an allegory, not a direct attack on the Queen, in which he suggested Isabeau was somewhat loose with her morals because of her dancing, and her dresses showed too much décolletage, shoulders and neck, a pattern which continued to be used against women with too much power for centuries afterwards. Modern historians are split on this issue, some thinking there may have been something to the rumours of Isabeau's affair. After all, she was in a marriage where her husband didn't recognise her most of the time, and it's possible she grew close to Louis, and others point out that it's highly likely those who didn't like a woman being in charge, and especially didn't like the Queen's tax rises, would have created this rumour in order to denounce her. Pro-Burgundian propaganda also hinted at the lewdness of a queen sleeping with her brother-in-law, and it's far more likely the whole thing was a rumour, although we also can't deny there's a chance it was built on some truth. John, however, went for something more tangible. He accused Isabeau and Louis of being fiscally challenged and demanded reparations for the loss of his royal revenues after his father's death, as more than half of the Burgundian crown's revenues had come from the French royal treasury in his father's time. He used this as a reason to mount yet another army of 1,000 men, this time entering Paris in 1405. The Duke of Orléans and Isabeau fled to the castle of Melun with her household and children a day behind, with John in pursuit. His men caught up with the household and he took the Dauphin Louis, Isabeau and Charles's third son. The boy was returned to Paris under Burgundian control, but John, Duke of Berry, his uncle, took him under his protection at the behest of the Royal Council. Charles was actually having a better period, and he helped calm down things for a month or so before relapsing. The Duke of Orléans raised his own army, and although John the Fearless attempted to make the Parisians revolt, they remained loyal to their king and his son. Yet again, Isabeau would be the one to mediate the conflict, this time following a letter from a woman who was probably Europe's first paid female writer, Christine de Pizan, and at the request of the Royal Council. But on the 23rd of November 1407, the Duke of Orléans was murdered by being dragged from his horse and hacked to death, his body left in a gutter. It was a horrifying event, and at first, John the Fearless denied any involvement. However, it was obvious who had carried out the orders, and he quickly changed his story and admitted he had ordered the Duke's murder after all. But, he added, that it was in fact for the Queen's honour, to restore it in light of the many rumours about her affair with Louis. Aside from the fact it was Burgundian propaganda to start with, it's obvious that really he was taking out Isabeau's greatest political ally with whom she had seen eye to eye. Unsurprisingly, the rest of the French royal family were not glad to hear about Louis's death and John's casual confession, and they forced him to leave Paris, while a peace negotiation was enacted between the Orléanists and the Burgundians at court. Unsurprisingly, violence broke out after the assassination, and Isabeau immediately had guards stationed around Paris to protect the Dauphin. Once again, she fled to the safety of Melun with her son and other children, but by August 1308 it was safe enough to once again bring him back to Paris, which was done in grand style. Isabeau's main problem now was that she had lost her biggest political ally. She has often come under criticism for not forming a party around herself, especially to protect her son's right to the throne, but this comes from a position of assuming there were political parties the way there are now. Alliances were loose and often based on trusting just one person in a group who shared a viewpoint, and shifting sides would not have been seen in the same way as now. This explains both Isabeau's ability to change who she aligned herself with and also why she never created a strong group of people around herself who shared her views. To help with his son's power during a more lucid moment, Charles arranged for an ordinance that gave the 13-year-old Louis more power if his mother wasn't present. This both protected the Dauphin and made it clear it was Isabeau holding the royal power behind the throne. Around March 1408, various chroniclers attempted to explain John's actions, trying to justify it by explaining Louis had apparently become a tyrant, but that actually, John had done the crown a favour by getting rid of him. It was a crazy leap, but with Charles not being of sound mind at the time, the king was convinced and pardoned Duke John. However, he had revoked this pardon by September. It became much more important for those who wanted to be in charge to have both Isabeau and Louis physically in their grasp. This meant Isabeau had no choice but to frequently change sides and flip between the Burgundians from around 1409 to 1413 and the Orléanists from 1413 to 1415. At the Peace of Chartres in March 1409, a grand spectacle was made of the fact that the royal couple had reconciled with John the Fearless, and Isabeau herself bestowed the title of Guardian of the Dauphin on the Duke and allowed him to mentor the young prince. This flip-flopping between everyone made Isabeau very unpopular, and although she was obviously trying to do what was best for her son with an incapacitated husband, many thought it showed her as flaky. Regardless of anyone's attempts to make peace, the tension had brewed for too many years, and in 1411 it broke out into the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. While Duke John initially had the upper hand, the Dauphin Louis was now 15 years old, and began to prove himself pretty handy at being in charge. While he couldn't hope to match the Burgundian forces, he did begin to build up a support network of close advisors and men, and Christine de Pizan, still patronised by his mother, wrote a glowing piece about how he was the saviour of all France. However, Isabeau had spent many years in charge, essentially, by this point, and it turned out she was unwilling to hand over the reins of power to her young son. She aligned with the Armagnacs, and in a true act of teenage rebellion, Louis decided to join John the Fearless. Henry V, now King of England, took full advantage of the situation. He invaded the northwest coast of France in 1415 and crushed the French forces sent to defend against him at Agincourt. It was devastating for the French, who lost huge numbers of men and military leaders in a single day. All Duke John had to do was simply to remain neutral as Henry continued relentlessly taking towns and cities in the north of France. However, in December of that year, the Dauphin unexpectedly died of an illness at the age of 18. Isabeau and Charles's fourth son, John of Touraine, now became the Dauphin. However, he had been brought up in the household of Duke William II of Bavaria in Hainaut after arrangements were made for him to marry the Duke's daughter, Jacqueline. So it was a shock to no one when he proved to have Burgundian sympathies, and on top of this, William refused to send him to Paris while the violence was still taking place. In 1416, Isabeau saw a possible way for a reconciliation to be made and tried to arrange a meeting with her daughter-in-law Jacqueline. However, the Armagnacs had no interest in peace being made with the Burgundians, and equally the young couple was still unable to travel to Paris, so it never happened. Things grew worse in 1417 when Henry V invaded once again, this time into Normandy. This was compounded in April as the Dauphin John died, leaving only one royal son left to take the place of heir, Charles, who would go on to become Charles VII of France, but he was still aged just 14. He was betrothed to Marie of Anjou, the daughter of the leader of the Armagnacs, Louis II of Anjou, and so naturally sided with them. Louis now kept Isabeau prisoner, confiscating many of her goods and separating her from her household and children in order to keep her compliant. She switched her allegiance to the Burgundians, and with the help of John the Fearless, she was able to secure her release, although many said John only helped in order to maintain control over the Queen. By January 1418, both Isabeau and John were acting as joint regents, and they got rid of Parliament before taking control of Paris in May. However, Dauphin Charles refused to enter the city by his mother's side, and a supposed reconciliation wouldn't happen until the 10th of September 1419. The two sides met at a bridge in Montereau, but in reality, it was a ploy to get John alone. Charles then took the opportunity to have him killed, hacking his body to pieces. King Charles immediately disinherited his son, but on the plus side, the civil war ended with John's death. In that same year, Henry V had occupied Normandy fully, and to make things more difficult for the French, the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had allied with the English. There was effectively no current heir available for the French throne either, as Dauphin Charles had been disinherited, and the next in line after that, Charles of Orléans, had been taken prisoner by the English. Isabeau, however, remained loyal to her husband, and it was obvious she was the person to speak with. Henry sent a messenger to arrange a meeting with the Queen, not with the King. It was clear a compromise had to be reached, and Isabeau travelled with Charles in May 1420 for the King to sign the Treaty of Troyes. However, Charles was too ill to sign, leaving Isabella to do yet another thing for him. This cemented her reputation as the woman who had signed away France, as although Charles remained king, Henry kept the territories he had gained, including Normandy, and he was to marry their daughter Catherine. This was part of a plan for him to become King of France after Charles's death, governing France alongside Philip the Good, and allowing Isabeau to reside in English-controlled Paris. However, in 1422, not only did Charles VI die, but so did Henry V, leaving Henry's young son Henry VI to become King of France in his place, with John of Lancaster acting as regent. Isabeau was now in her 50s, and she was described by some people as living quite a loose life. In other words, once again, there was a smear campaign to discredit her. This is considered to probably have been English propaganda to cement their hold on the French throne, as Isabeau was a competent alternative to a small foreign child and an English regent. Rumours of her alleged affairs began again, and this time there were whispers that the disinherited Dauphin was in fact not the son of Charles VI at all. Oddly, at the same time, there were also pamphlets that compared Isabeau to Joan of Arc, who had come on the scene, and claimed she would still save France. It was obvious Isabeau's political influence was too great, and she was removed from the political sphere altogether. She was sent to live at the Hôtel Saint-Paul, and she would remain there until her death in late September 1435. Her body was sent on a funeral cortege along the Seine, and her funeral was documented by the eyewitness Jean Chartier of Saint-Denis Abbey. In the centuries that would follow, Isabeau would be painted as an incompetent queen playing with power, without the political acumen to back it up. She was accused of being a bad mother, despite evidence now showing she was a devoted mother who kept her children close and tried to act in their best interests. The king's madness even created rumours that she was a witch and had cast a spell on him, and accusations of adultery followed her for decades, casting aspersions on her character whenever her political opponents needed ammunition. In other words, her political character assassination was unique for the time because she was a woman, and not many women were in the political sphere. In truth, Isabeau appears to have not only been a model queen, but a trailblazer of her time when it came to politics. In an era when women were not openly allowed to be politicians, Isabeau handled alliances, treaties, and remained fluid in a changing situation in order to maintain the throne for her children. She was admired by many, including Christine de Pizan, another woman who broke the mold in her time. She was also loyal to her husband to the end, and while his illness meant that many times she could have claimed power for herself or aligned with someone who would have taken her husband off the throne, she both remained by his side and probably also recognized it allowed power for herself. In short, Isabeau does not deserve to be remembered as a treacherous, adulterous woman, but instead as a politician trying to deal with a difficult and violent period of time, above all, still being a queen and a mother to the end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.